I want people to feel less alone. I spent so much of my time growing up and even earlier in my career feeling really isolated, feeling really alone, whether it was because I was the only female on my team or because I only reported to men or because I just like have a lot of stuff going on in my personal life. Like I felt alone. And I think any opportunity I can to be a little bit more vulnerable and to let other people know, like, it's okay if you feel like this because I feel like this, or I have felt like this too. Like you're not weird or you're not alone, or I want to make people feel seen. I just think I spent so much of my life feeling see-through.
This isn't your average revenue podcast. It's Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue Playlist, powered by Comsor. And it's your new work bestie. Through conversations with other women in the revenue space, Ashley and Katrina get candid about their unique experiences, help women tackle challenges in the workplace, and uncover ways to grow as revenue pros. Maybe you'll learn a little, cry a little, laugh a little, have an epiphany, or at the very least, get a killer playlist to listen to while you work. Being a woman in this industry is wild. Let's talk about it.
Hello, I'm Ashley.
And I'm Katrina.
Welcome to Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue Playlist. Today, we're joined by Zoe Hartsfield, who is running Executive Presence and Influencer Management at Apollo. Zoe, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We're very, very excited for this one in particular. And real quick, I'm going to read your bio in case our listeners don't know who you are, but they probably do because they're probably living under a rock. But for those of you under those rocks, Zoe is a salesperson trapped in a marketer's body. If sales is Batman, then she is Robin. She's an advisor, keynote speaker, and content creator. She has extensive experience in sales, community marketing, and all things go-to-market. And of course, building brands on LinkedIn. And her 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., you can find her running the Executive Presence program and Evangelism at Apollo, on their community team specifically. But in her 5 p.m. to 9 a.m., you might run into her at the gym, at a coffee shop, or hanging out with her grandma, which we will need to know about your grandma very shortly. Today, Zoe is joining us to talk about her extremely impressive quick progression from SDR to a leadership role, vulnerability and toxicity on LinkedIn, which is going to get real juicy, and of course, just her experience as a woman in revenue. Zoe, thank you for joining us. And Ashley, do you want to give a little background on the musical twist to our podcast?
Yes. So in case this is your first time listening, the reason we call this the Infinite Revenue Playlist is because our podcast was inspired by the concept of having a walk-up song. So like an athlete, as customer-facing professionals, when we're tied to revenue, we are often compared to somebody who is out there on a professional field, and a walk-up song is something that they would potentially actually literally walk out onto the field with. So instead of playing these songs as we're walking out to play sports, we are playing these before we walk into work or roll into our home office and crush our day. We can't play the songs live on the show, but there is an actual playlist that you can check out on Spotify. So Zoe, what is your walk-up song?
Oh my gosh, first of all, I love this concept and I can't wait to go jump and hit up that playlist because I bet it's epic. Today my walk-up song has to be Toxic by Britney Spears because of some of the things we're going to talk about today. But I'm particularly excited to talk about workplace toxicity, not just what it is, but also what it isn't. I think like in some ways, we as a society have kind of over-rotated and we start thinking like, well, that's toxic, that's toxic, that's toxic. And like, there's definitely some things that are just work or like life. It might not actually be toxic. And so kind of running through, the experiences I've had online by being somebody who's decided to put myself out there on the internet, experiences I've had within the workplace, and then how to manage that. Because like, if you're not careful, it can get to you real quick. So excited to dive in.
Yeah. And I think that ties into your vulnerability, which is another thing we want to talk about, is your ability to live out loud on the internet and talk to these topics pretty in a very educated way. So I love it.
So why don't we dive right into it then? And I think this is a perfect topic to cover because if you don't know this, Ashley and I actually host a monthly meetup for women in revenue through the Gong community. And this topic comes up quite often of dealing just with toxic matters as women in the professional setting and just not knowing how to handle it. And something that you just said, he said, we talk about toxicity all the time, but we don't really know what it is or what it isn't. So I would love to hear from you. Like, what do you think toxic environment or behavior looks like, and how do you personally handle it?
Yeah, so I think anything that is like unnecessarily aggressive, inappropriate, or excessive in the workplace, in sort of like the professional networking space, I would probably categorize as toxic. But I think sometimes we like kind of get a little, I know I can be sensitive sometimes. And every once in a while I have to gut check myself. Like, is this person giving me a valid criticism, or am I like, are they actually being unfair to me? And so it's like really kind of trying to sift through, like taking a step out of yourself, taking a step out of the day that I'm having, because somebody could say something to me one day and I'm like, that's so wrong. And they might say it to me the next day and I like wouldn't care. And it might just depend on the day that I'm having. So I think it's really important to think through like, what is a healthy work environment and what does that scope look like? And then like things that fall outside of those bounds, that's when you start to kind of evaluate toxicity. And I think like something we talked about kind of before we started recording was what happens online. And the way that I see it, and this is my own personal take it or leave it, I have chosen to put myself out there on the internet. And so to some degree, you have to, there's like a direct correlation with like the amount of vulnerable I'm willing to be. And am I allowed to swear on this? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Hell
Okay.
yeah.
Great. The amount of vulnerable I'm going to be, there's like a proportional amount of shit I need to be willing to take, because people will just like throw punches for some reason. Now, I think it's gotten a lot better. I don't know about you all, but a year and a half ago on LinkedIn, I used to get some pretty crazy DMs from some strangers. It's definitely calmed down. I think LinkedIn has cracked down on some of that a little bit, or they're trying to. But I do think it's important to kind of know that like I have decided to put myself out there, and therefore I anticipate some level of criticism or punches. Does it mean I deserve it? Not necessarily, but I do think it kind of comes with the territory. I think if I never ever put myself out there, I'd probably get a lot less shit from people. And like that's something I have decided I am willing to take. Now there's obviously a line. Sometimes things go a little too far. Might have to report or block a person or two. It happens. But I do just want to call that out, because sometimes people will be like, no one should ever like criticize you or challenge you on your content. And it's like, no, like, can we not have like a conversation? Can we not have like a debate or like a dynamic chat? I think that is healthy. And it's just kind of like finding that line for yourself.
Katrina and I have gotten, because a lot of times our content is about women and being a woman in revenue, and that's just the thing that we care most about. Sometimes people will slide into your DMs or even post publicly something that is a great teaching moment, but sometimes we have to tell ourselves like it's okay for us to not be the person to give them that lesson, because that's exhausting and it's not really up to us to have to constantly teach people how to not talk to us, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I heard it once said like this, like you can care about people and leave them where they're at. It's not always your job to drag them over the line or, to your point, teach them a lesson. I think there are sometimes opportunities to educate. I think, and this is just my own personal take, and something I've learned actually, I've changed my stance on this. I used to be very pro cancel culture, and like I kind of regret that. I used to be very pro like cancel anyone who is a jerk. Like I want them to have their name like I want their head on a spike on the internet, you know? Like that was like I was just so about it because I felt so, I don't know, like insecure or powerless or whatever, like whatever I was going through. And I've really changed my stance on that. I actually don't think, and there's exceptions to every rule, and this is my own take, but I don't think that's actually that productive. Like it's not really like teaching or educating or like coming alongside someone. People have their opinions based on their lived experience typically. And so if no one ever does like come to them and has a calm conversation and says, hey, like I want to challenge that thought process, then how are they supposed to learn and grow? And part of the reason I have changed my stance on that is because a mentor of mine has come alongside me and been like, I want to challenge that thought process. Is it really that productive for you to like rip into people who are being mean? You're being just as mean to them, but like you feel a little more justified because they were the bully first. And I was like, that's a really interesting take. And I would say in the last like 18 months or so, I've really taken a shift and try to be more kind in my response, really, really gracious, really understanding, or I just ignore it. I'm like, you know what? To your point, not my job, not my circus, not my monkeys. Like, I'm not going to run this conversation, but I also don't need to rip them a new one just because I felt frustrated by what they said.
We're obviously talking about this in the setting of LinkedIn and like posting publicly and not necessarily dealing with people who are your coworkers. But I think everything you just said applies internally as well, right? The way you interact with your boss or the people that report to you. I think leaders can be very quick to criticize or jump down people's throats when things don't happen exactly the way they like it. And that's not necessarily the best way to provide a teaching moment to people on your team, in my opinion. And I think that really does set apart good leaders from bad leaders of how they handle certain situations like that.
That's a really interesting take. And Katrina, you're a leader yourself. Like, I'm sure you've had to have coaching moments with your people. And like the way that I think about it, and I've written about this recently, and something that I've learned from having really, really great leaders, incredible leaders who I admire, like shout out Mandy Schnurl and Elvis Greer, you guys are the best. And then having some not so great leaders who were really good at like criticizing people in public. And I realized that the reason they do that is because they don't know how to coach. People who don't know how to coach default to criticism because they don't know how to motivate people. And I think it like the trick is, and I heard Layla Hormozi say this, it's not about motivating people. It's just about not demotivating them. If you hire motivated people, it's pretty easy to keep them motivated as long as you aren't like beating them into the ground and discouraging them left and right. It's like once you start doing that, it is really, really hard to get them back up. So just maintaining the level of motivation that they come in with is probably the most important thing you can do as a leader. And I think that coaching is a way to build people up and encourage people as opposed to criticism, which tends to cut people down at the knees if it's not done well. And that's not to say we should never correct, we should never teach, like we absolutely should. But I think there's a way to do it that comes with like from a place of like, I want you to be the best version of you, as opposed to like, you're a piece of shit and you suck at your job, get it together. Like those two things hit real different.
And I don't know about the two of you, but I have experienced both. And I know how I personally react to the different types of coaching and leadership. And it's one of the most important things for me when I'm looking at maybe a new organization. It's the leader and the person who's going to be giving me that direct feedback, because going back to toxic, that's if someone is tearing you down daily, that to me is definitely a toxic thing.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I just think about like the rate of burnout. Like there's probably a direct correlation to how quickly you take a nosedive in your job based on how much criticism you are getting on a regular basis versus like encouragement, correction. I had a manager once, Mandy, who was incredible at giving feedback. Like I'd walk away from the conversation knowing that she gave me feedback and yet not feeling bad about myself at all. Like it wasn't the compliment sandwich. It wasn't anything. It was like, here, like you crushed this thing. Here's one tweak I would make so that the next time we do it, it is even better than the great work that you just did. And also keep it up. I love working with you. And like, in retrospect, that one thing she wanted me to change was something I actually probably didn't do the best at. But it wasn't like, hey, you sucked at this. It was just like, hey, we're going to do this again in 6 weeks. And I think if you made this one change, you'll knock it out of the park. I was like, oh my God, I feel so, like I'd walk away from those conversations feeling so good and recognizing like an hour later, like, oh, I think that was actually feedback. But like, it was like, I heard it, I implemented it, I didn't feel bad about myself. Like if you can coach people and have them walk away not feeling bad about yourself, it's very hard to do. But I think that is like, those are the best leaders in the back of my head. The ones that are like super encouraging. They're able to point out ways for you to improve, but it's not like, you sucked at this. It's like, let's take this to the next level. It is not pointing how low you are. It is like calling you up to higher things. And I think that's sort of the difference. And I've also had leaders who don't do that. And they'll write in Slack corrections about like dumb little things because they want everybody to see it so that you feel shamed into making a change. And that works for me in the short term. I would say I'm like, I do well with negative motivation, negative reinforcement for a very short period of time because I like want to win. I want to prove people wrong. But at a point, there's like diminishing returns and my mental health tanks. And then I feel really bad about myself. And then I probably suck at my job. And that's kind of like, I think that's why positive reinforcement is tends to be a better tool. But, you know, everybody's different.
I think also revenue leaders in general, there's just a lot of pressure with hitting our goals, right? Like building pipeline, getting enough meetings, bringing enough revenue. And obviously at the top, you're feeling a lot of pressure for meeting those goals. So I do, to an extent, understand why I think sales leaders or revenue leaders get a bad rep for being bad managers, because they're so stressed out and they take it out on their reports. Like, why aren't you booking more meetings? Why aren't you closing these deals? I'm not saying they're right, but I understand it. And I think you're right that it's, you know, that positive reinforcement, I think that's a really difficult tool to use and perform well when you're in that type of role. But I think we should all be practicing it, and it will set apart those amazing leaders from those subpar leaders. But this is a bit of a loaded question, Zoe. Do you think that women in revenue roles specifically tend to be used that tool, more specifically the positive reinforcement, versus men? Or do you think there's no difference between genders, it's just the person?
Okay, so here's my hot take. I think women are expected to use that tool more than men. I think there is a double standard, and that if a man uses negative reinforcement, it's not frowned upon to the same degree that it would be like if a woman used, like she would be described as a bitch, whereas like a man would be described as like just an assertive dude, you know, yeah, intense, whatever. Like so I think it's like, I do think probably it airs a little more on the female side. I'm like trying to think about my experiences, but I've had great female leaders and I've had super terrible female leaders.
Same.
And I've only worked for females in the last like 2 years of my career. But like I've also had great male leaders and really terrible male leaders. Had an excellent non-binary leader. Like, you know, like there's just, it all spans the gambit. But I think that there is an unfair expectation that women have to be positive because we get so much shit if we're not. We're painted in this worse light as opposed to just like, oh, well, they're assertive or they like take action or they're, you know, they're like running the team. It's like, no, she's a bitch or she's like the worst or I hate, like she's so mean, whatever. And that's like not a take that I came to on my own. I actually used to have that expectation. I was like, well, I work for a woman. Like she should be really like empathetic and understanding. And I have, again, worked for women who totally are. And I've worked for one that was really shockingly not. And I was like, why? Like, I don't understand it. And I was so frustrated and talking to one of my mentors and she's like, do you think that like you feel that way more intensely? Like if she was a man, would you feel the same way? And I was like, interesting challenge. I do think it was still like she was a super toxic leader and like not great at her job. But it was an interesting challenge to me to think about like the gender binary and that maybe it's not even that binary, but like how much pressure do we put on women to be that empathetic, encouraging leader and we let men slide, you know?
I think that's a really good call out because, you know, we love to talk about the differences between how men and women are treated and how like men create so much inequality, but like we're also sustaining those what's the word I'm looking for?
Bias,
stereotypes.
Yeah, biases.
Like,
Stereotypes, right? Like the fact that you as a woman yourself had to stop and think, am I thinking this way because she is a woman demonstrating this? Like, would I feel the same way if a male leader was doing this?
Yeah, it's just about challenging those assumptions. Sometimes it's still true, you know, like, but just taking that step back and kind of like taking a look at the filter you're looking at the situation through is really important. But yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, in a dream world, we have competent, empathetic, and like encouraging leaders. Like those are the three things that I want in a leader. And competency comes into like, there are moments where maybe you need to be a little bit more like, hey, we got to kick it into gear. Like we have numbers. One of the things that you mentioned about like revenue leaders in particular is, you know, it's a different ballpark than, you know, if you were in product or if you were in a different part of the business. Revenue is so cyclical and repetitive, the clock resets on the first or on the first of the quarter or like whatever. And you have numbers to hit. And it doesn't matter how great the team did last month if you suck this month, because your head is on the line as a leader. And so I do think it is a unique challenge that revenue leaders face, as opposed to, you know, parts of the business that maybe work in like sprints or like projects or like longer term goals, because everything is so black and white. It's like we hit our number or we didn't. It starts over next month. We have to do it again. We have to do it again. And I think in particular, it's really difficult for revenue leaders to celebrate wins because they know that that clock resets in 2 days or 3 days or whatever. And so I do think it's like a really unique challenge. I also think it is probably a space ripe for like not restructuring, but just like rethinking the way that we approach it, because some of the best sales leaders I've ever worked for cared so much about me and less about my number. Now, I think as a byproduct, I consistently hit my number because they cared about me. And like maybe they knew that, and maybe that was all a strategy. Maybe they never cared about me at all. They just wanted me to hit my number, but they made me feel cared for. Yeah. And that made me feel motivated to work harder. And it made me feel like supported and empowered and enabled. And I think those things work really well. But yeah, it's just like, man, it's a tough industry. And I think particularly right now, I know this episode's probably coming out later than we're recording it, but damn, the market is rough.
It's hard.
I really hope when this comes out, the market is amazing and people are like, what are you talking
everyone's
about?
listening, like, what are you talking about? It's
like,
so
easy
to sell.
So good.
150% of quota.
Yeah.
Like,
I was just going to say, Zoe, I think it's a really important call out, because I started seeing a new therapist, which I also now can't see because I moved states and that's a thing. But she actually spent most of her time trying to get me to question whether or not sales was a good place for me, because I have anxiety, and she is a cognitive behavioral therapist. And so she was saying, you've got 3 types of thinking. You've got people who are future thinkers in the moment and past thinkers. And depression comes from the past thinkers. People who are in the moment are a little more well-balanced, and the anxiety comes from future thinking. And if I'm in sales, I am future thinking all the time. Like, I literally have to think about next quarter, pipeline, building, all of that. And she was like, well, why did you choose this career? Like, maybe you should quit your job. And I'm like, well, that's the thing I'm really good at, so I'm probably not going to quit.
I'm probably going to stick with this.
I'm not going to start over. That's not a good idea. But I think it's a really good call out, because the way that this whole revenue org, especially in SaaS and tech, is built is anxiety inducing. And that's a really hard environment to be in. And I don't know what the solution is. I don't know how we fix that, or if it'll ever be fixed, but it's part of the reason I think we get so much burnout in sales. And that's not a good thing.
I think that is a super poignant point to make. Also love that you see a therapist. Shout out therapy. Big fan. I think you're right. I heard it once said that the past is dead. The future isn't real. The only power we have is in the present. And I've tried my best to empower that. But like, as a person who literally lives in both the past and present, or past and future at all times, and is like riddled with depression and anxiety on any given day, it's hard. It's like really hard. Not to like take yourself. But I do find that like mindfulness, things like therapy, things like taking care of myself help with those symptoms or sort of like byproducts of the job. Like, anyone in a revenue role probably feels similarly. I think it is probably most acute in sales more than any other part of the revenue organization. But I do think CS people feel it when renewals are coming up. I do think marketers feel it when it's like, oh God, we are pacing so far behind our MQL number, whatever they're measured on, you know? It's like, it's rampant in our industry, and especially like we said right now, when the market is kind of like, but yeah.
I think us 3 needs to start a petition for every sales org having an on-site therapist for their team.
Oh my gosh, right?
Yep.
Like, I remember a company my friend worked for had like a on staff. It was actually somebody who used to be a sports psychologist who like worked with the team. Not that they're playing sports, but it was like
athletes, walk-up songs, and sports psychology.
But she was just telling me, she's like, it was an incredible experience to talk to somebody who understood that like performance was the goal. You know, like it's a different, like to your point,
Yeah.
Ashley, like your therapist was like, maybe you should just quit. You're like, no, I need you to help me like get to the point where I can hit my number. Like performance is the end goal, not quitting my job. And I think it's just, you know, like par for the course. But I thought that was so fascinating that that company was like, I think we need like a performance sports psychologist on the team. And so they were just like on staff, and you could like make an appointment. You could go see her once a week if you wanted as a sales rep. And I just thought that was like such an interesting benefit to provide to the revenue organization. I was like, damn, how long till that is universal? Yeah, I thought that was so cool.
That's like the show Billions, which I hate. Can't stand watching that show, but my husband watches it or watched it. I think it's done now. But like at the very beginning, I watched like 1 or 2 episodes, and they had a staff psychologist. She was a very important character and
very important to the story
that I don't really know anything about, because I was like, I hate this. I'm at a point in my life where I don't like watching things that stress me out, because I get enough of that at work and with kids.
Gosh.
So if it's not like, if I'm watching something and it's making me like, then I'm like, I'm out. I'm too old for that. I can't.
Oh yeah, I don't watch drama at all. I watch reruns of The Office and Parks and Rec almost constantly, because I just need something where it's like, yes, love Schitt's Creek, where I can just turn my brain off and like be loosely entertained, and something where I've probably seen it before, so that if I fall asleep, it's like not a big deal. I'm so boring when it comes to TV.
For me, it's reruns of The Office or Gilmore Girls.
Ooh,
I've never actually seen Gilmore Girls.
You need to.
And my daughter's name is Rory, and apparently that's a thing, right?
You might as well. I don't know. I think if I watched it for the very first time now, I might not have the same affinity for it as I did when I was like 14. But
yeah,
I'm obsessed.
However old I was, but it's still great. Like
I've heard like you had to be there, and now it would probably be a little hard to get into it. So I haven't committed to it.
I disagree.
Maybe when your daughter's a little older, you watch it together. That could be fun.
That would be cute.
Yeah.
It's like a coming of age / mom and daughter type show. So yeah, that would be good.
Okay.
All right, I want to go back to talking about LinkedIn specifically, because Zoe, obviously you're very good at building your social brand on there, and specifically doing it in a way where you're like very authentic, and you write a lot about you and your life, and you're very vulnerable. And I think a lot of people want to replicate that, but they're very scared to do that, because putting yourself out there is really freaking scary. And on a recent post of yours that I read and liked and commented on, all 3.
Thank you.
You said, I was called a tryhard at least 100 times growing up. It was always meant as an insult. I want to get into that, because I think a lot of people that want to build their social brand probably are thinking, they're like, well, my friends follow me or my coworkers. I don't want them like making fun of me or screenshotting my posts and sending it to each other. And I want to know more about just your experience of like how you got to where you are now on LinkedIn, why you choose to be vulnerable, and like how you combat kind of that feeling of feeling like a tryhard.
How I got to this point and like why I create the content that I create is sort of a 2-part answer. Number 1, this one's more like strategic. I am not an expert in sales or marketing yet. I am learning in real time. And so the expertise that I can bring comes from my lived experience. Therefore, I try, and I've made a harsher pivot towards this in the last couple of months, because I'm like, you know what? I don't want to give advice. I want to tell people how I did it and let them do with that what they will. Because it's one thing if I'm like, you should XYZ. I don't know your ICP. I don't know like what your day-to-day looks like. I don't know what your reporting structure looks like. Like I could give you advice that's totally worthless because you work at a Fortune 500 company and I work for, a Series A startup, right? So I think it's less about me giving advice and more about me just speaking from my experience and trying to share like, here's how this is what I did. This was my story, because I think it comes across a little bit more authentic, a little bit less like I'm telling you what to do, because I don't know if that's what you should do. Maybe you should do something else. And so that was sort of the strategy there. The other part, this is more like the emotional, selfish part of me, is I want people to feel less alone. I spent so much of my time growing up and even earlier in my career feeling really isolated, feeling really alone, whether it was because I was the only female on my team, or because I only reported to men, or because I just like have a lot of stuff going on in my personal life. Like I felt alone. And I think any opportunity I can to be a little bit more vulnerable and to let other people know, like, it's okay if you feel like this because I feel like this, or I have felt like this too. Like you're not weird, or you're not alone, or I want to make people feel seen. I just think I spent so much of my life feeling see-through. I don't want anyone else to feel unseen like I did. And so I think that's sort of the second part of that answer. I think when it comes to doing that online, the advice I would give, loose advice, this is what I did, is I spoke from my experience. You are an expert in your experience. It's the only thing you're an expert in, unless you probably have, 10 plus years of experience in the one thing that you totally mastered over the last couple of years. And if you do, amazing. I will call you an expert all day long. That's not my story. And so I can really just speak to myself 2 years ago. And that's usually who I'm writing for, is I'm usually writing for some past version of myself, assuming there's somebody else out there who can relate, and seeing what happens. And I think like I've really become more intentional about that in the last couple of weeks since I left Swan Tide and am on to my next thing. And I think for me, like really focusing on what would have helped me, back then, even 6 months ago. I think that's the way that I write, because it comes from a more authentic place, as opposed to me being like, I'm going to go be a sales and marketing thought leader because I have thoughts that should lead people. Like most of my thoughts are just, whatever I woke up thinking that day. And so I think writing from that place, if you're thinking about getting started, if you're like, I don't know, people might make fun of me. Oh, that was the last piece. My coworkers see this, whatever. The point of that post was specifically about all those people, all my peers criticizing me, and all is a relative term, a lot of them criticizing me for working hard. There were plenty of other things I didn't have to try that hard at. I was like really good at school. I was good at music. Like there were certain things that were kind of effortless for me, but the things I cared about and wanted to be good at was sports. And I wasn't like particularly gifted in sports. All I had was my work ethic, and I would just like out hustle people. I would run longer. I would run faster. I had more endurance, whatever. And that was why I was good at soccer. It wasn't because I had the best ball handling. It was because I would literally just like run people down. And that was kind of like the way that I set myself apart and earned scholarships and did all the things. And people would make fun of me, but they were people who didn't want to put in the same effort that I was putting in. And those people did not get the scholarships. And those people didn't end up leaving the town that we grew up in. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to do that, like, I don't want to make this a criticism about people who stay in their hometown or like whatever, but I just know they talked about big dreams that they had and they never pursued them. And that makes me really sad. And so I think like putting in effort is not uncool. It might have been in high school, but now I'm like, I can see where that effort took me and where it's going to take me, I believe. And I'll take being called to try hard all day if it gets me to where I want to go.
I think of kind of the classic like 90s movie, like high school movie right now when you're talking about all this, where the popular kids were always like shown in this light where they didn't really care about school. They like, like the nerd, right? Like, oh, you care about getting good grades. You're such a nerd. What a loser.
You care? So gross.
You care? What
That's
the
not
hell?
cool.
No. And now it's like, in my opinion, I think it's like completely 180'd, where it's like, if you don't care and you don't try, that is really unattractive, both in like a personal setting and especially in a professional setting.
I totally agree. And I think especially like with the rise of Gen Z kind of entering the workforce, like people talk about their quiet quitting or talk about like these other things, but you know what? They're like really engaged. They care about a lot of stuff. They care about social issues. They care about the environment. They care about a lot. They care about mental health more than I think we did when we were in high school. Like people used to make fun of kids who had to go to like therapy. It was like, oh, something's wrong with you. And now I'm like, therapy's the coolest. Like I wish I had that same mentality. I never made fun of anybody back then, but like I felt insecure when my parents were like, I think you need to go see a therapist, because I was really depressed in high school. And I was like, no one can know that I'm like this sad. And now it's like, people are like, what, you're not in therapy? That's weird. Like it's almost taken like
you don't want to work through your problems. Okay.
You don't want to be the best version of yourself. That's okay. I'm not saying people who don't go to therapy are weird, but I'm just saying like that's kind of like the take now is like it's so normal. And I think that's like a needed shift in the perspective. So I'm really excited about like the younger generation entering the workforce and how that's going to change the way that we approach what we do. But I think care is something you cannot fake. It's not really something you can generate into people. I think it kind of circles back to that very first thing we were talking about is like, it's less about motivating people or trying to get people to care. It's about finding people who already care and are motivated and just not demotivating them. That's how you keep a healthy work environment, is just making sure that you are not cutting them down at the knees or making them feel less than or making them feel unsupported. It's like, if you can just keep them enabled and empowered, block and tackle, and then get the hell out of the way, like, if you're good at hiring, I think you're going to see some really, really good results.
Zoe, I also think that people like you who are being vulnerable out loud and talking about these things, I think that's part of the reason why it's becoming more normalized. And I think that is really important to call out, because it's not just about not being made fun of by your friends. It's also about letting that one or two, like a couple people might see a new creator might get 2 likes, but maybe 100 people saw that post and 2 of those people actually needed to hear it, and now they don't feel alone, and now they can be out loud about it, and then everyone's going to accept it, and all of a sudden therapy is not something to be embarrassed about. And I think that that's really important, and I think that that's like something good that you're doing that you may not even realize you're doing. Or maybe
Thank
you
you.
do. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, like, someday I'm so insecure. Like, people may or may not know that about me, but like, I'm a really insecure person. I mean, 9 times out of 10, I'm thinking about myself, not the other person, as much as I care about other people.
Sure.
I'm just like, I'm in my head a lot about a lot of things. And so I totally understand that feeling of like, oh my gosh, what if I post this and like nobody looks at it? We'll flip that over. Like, nobody saw it, so nobody knows that it didn't do well, you know? Like, there are different ways you can look at each side of the coin. And I think like continuing to put yourself out there, being authentically you, like, typically that gets rewarded by other people who are drawn to that. And like, you will attract the people who need to hear it, to your point. And you'll come across eventually the people who are like, wow, like, I didn't realize that this person's perspective was missing from my life, but it was. And I think about like my favorite mentors aren't, you know, necessarily LinkedIn famous, but every once in a while I'll like catch something on their post and I'm like, this is so profound. I need like 900 more people to like and comment on this, because like everybody needs to see this. And so it's less about, you know, the loudest voices getting the most engagement. Like, I think it's about cultivating your feed and who you want to be surrounded by, to make sure that like you're putting interesting things into your brain. And that doesn't necessarily mean like everything that sounds the same. I don't want to live in an echo chamber, but I do think that there is value in like cultivating a community online to create that healthy environment. Like, I try my best to make sure that like the people I connect with are not crazy, you know? And crazy is a weird term. That's not the right word I want to use. Like, not aggressive or toxic in that sense. And when people, I kind of take the approach, and I'm curious to hear what you guys do, but like when people connect with me, I'm like, innocent until proven otherwise, right? And then the second somebody like is super weird or inappropriate in the DMs or hits me with a terrible pitch or like whatever, that's when it's like, okay,
You're
maybe,
like, bye.
maybe we don't want to do this. And like, I'm not going to like block or report somebody for pitching me, but I might be like, okay, no more one-to-one connection for you. Like, we could just like be in the periphery together. If somebody hits on me in the DMs, I do block them, but that doesn't happen nearly as much anymore. It was really prevalent back in like 2022, but it seems to have calmed down, thankfully.
I always screenshot those and send them immediately to Ashley.
Oh man. Well, one time I posted about it and I like blocked out everybody's name, and one of our board members thought that was not appropriate of me to do. And so this was...
But was it appropriate for them to slide in your DMs uninvited?
It was not. And this was several companies ago, and I don't know who the board member was. And like, that's a, like, it was just one of those things. It was another one of those moments where I was sort of challenged with that whole like cancel culture. It was like, is this the best way to do it? And it's like, I don't know the answer, but I think I've taken a different stance, and now it's just like bye.
Ignored.
Like, I'll just, see you later, you know?
So I want to talk about this a little bit more about people maybe not necessarily sliding in your DMs and hitting on you, but obviously if you post more vulnerable stuff, as you said earlier in our conversation, you're probably going to get more shit from shitty people, for lack of better words. How do you handle that, right? Like, when do you choose to respond versus ignore, block, delete? And for anyone else that experiences that themselves, like, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I can think of two very specific. I don't know why they're so top of mind still, because one of them happened a year ago and one of them happened like a year and a half ago. But I think about two posts that were like pretty vulnerable that I shared. One was about a sexual assault I experienced when I was 20. And I wrote about that because it was conference season, and like this did not happen at a conference. I just want to clarify that experience did not occur at a conference. But I don't know about you both, but like I get nervous walking alone at night from a bar to my hotel, or I get nervous like if I'm the only female in the group traveling, or even like going up in the elevator at the hotel. Like I'm just like, ugh. And it's maybe like an over rotation based on that experience, but apparently it's PTSD, and I feel that way. And so I like wrote about that experience, and then I gave some like safety tips. I was just like, hey, like if you're there with another person, consider sharing your location with that person just while you're at the conference, so that you guys know like where the other person is. That way, if anything happens, like you've got eyes on that human being. Or, you know, like I gave tips to men. I was like, hey, if you don't know a woman, like maybe don't walk immediately behind her on the sidewalk. Like give her some room. Don't match her pace. Like those things can sometimes come across as like threatening, especially at night. And so like I was just giving like practical tips. Some guy swooped in and was like, wow, can't believe you would use your experience for engagement. And I was like, what? And then this is the thing. This is where the advice comes in. I was just like, I'm really sorry you feel that way. Like I'm not, but I don't know how to convince you. And I just kind of like left it at that. Probably 30 people who do know me swooped in and like came to my defense. I didn't ask them. I didn't like reach out to them, but it was like people who know and care about me stood up for me. And like, not that I condone like bullying somebody or anything like that, but they were just like, hey, that's like really missing the point of this post. Or like, that's like, you know, people kind of stood up for me. And I think that is like, your character will shine through in the ways that like the people that you've impacted will kind of come to your aid in those moments. And that's kind of like one thing that I've learned is like, I try not to defend myself as much as I can. I try not to defend myself as hard as it is. The other instance was somebody was like, really, it had to do with Roe v. Wade. Last year I wrote a post and somebody was like, you don't really mean any of that. Like, again, it was like, you're just doing this for engagement. And I was like, why? Like, I am a woman, and I like, this is like an important like topic for me to speak on. And he was trying to just like rip me a new one. And I did kind of engage with him a little bit. And then I stopped, and then he wrote a post about me and like about my post. And then same thing happened. People came and like stepped up and showed up to kind of like defend me or just like support me, I suppose. And I think the lesson that I've learned is just like, it's not worth defending yourself. It makes them look worse than it makes you look. And if you defend yourself like too much, or you over rotate and you start attacking them, that you become the bad guy. Not really, but it could be perceived that way. And it's like, yeah, for me, it's like it's so easy to let the one shitty comment outweigh the 100 encouraging and positive ones. Those ones stick in my brain. Like I couldn't tell you any other comment on those posts. They both had, you know, probably 300 or 400 comments a piece. The only ones I remember are those mean ones. Yeah. And it's just like, that's like the way that the human brain works, because we're, you know, lizards or whatever. But like, it's just so crazy. And I wish it didn't work like that. But I guess the advice I would give is like, try and let it roll. 9 times out of 10, someone else's criticism has more to do with them than it has to do with you.
Yep.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing those stories with us and feeling comfortable and being that vulnerable, because we definitely have women that listen to this show that have experienced similar things. And I guarantee your posts are helping them.
Mm-hmm.
And second, you know, you can't always make everyone happy, right? It's like, the internet is the craziest place of them all. So, and LinkedIn is part of the internet. So when you put yourself out there and you post those sorts of things, like you are just naturally going to receive situations like that. And I love your advice of like, I know it's hard and easier said than done, but just let it sit. It really probably has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them.
Yeah, I would say I appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, as difficult as it is, and this is like a lesson learned the hard way from not doing that, from trying to defend myself, from trying to whatever, and having a mentor, one of my favorite human beings in the whole world, Christine Rogers, just be like, dude, like, don't waste your energy. It's not for you. Like that's a them problem. Let it go. And it doesn't actually make you look better to like come to your own defense all the time. There are obviously exceptions to every rule and situation. I am not saying just let people walk all over you or like throw punches at you. That's not the message here, but it's like sometimes it's totally fine to just like let it slide.
And sometimes if you're responding to every other comment and you don't respond to it, that's enough of a response in itself.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Ashley and I experienced someone trying to tear us and our podcast down a little bit. And for probably about 2 weeks, I feel like it was a little all-consuming. And we were texting each other back and forth, like stressed about it, being like, what is this person doing? Like, we don't understand. And then finally we got to the point where we're like, you know what? We're going to stop responding. Out of sight, out of mind. We don't care anymore. And it's been so great ever since. I have no idea what that person's saying. And quite frankly, I don't give a shit.
My dad always says, like, don't let the haters live rent-free in your head.
Yeah.
Like, and he's probably like the most, has like the best ability to let things roll of anyone I've ever met in my whole life. Like sometimes people will just like wrong him in the most egregious way. And he's like, man, whatever, they're probably having a bad day. And I'm like, what? Like I would just never, but he lives so much more carefree than I do in a lot of ways. And I'm like, maybe I should take like a page out of your book there. Because yeah, it does. Like it'll ruin your week if you let it, or in your case, 2 weeks. And it's like, what could you have done with that extra mental space? I don't know. But I'm glad
probably a lot.
I'm glad that you were able to like move past it. Because again, it has so much more to do with them than it had to do with you guys. You guys are crushing it. And I love this podcast.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate that.
We got to do our, we still have to do our
Would you
rathers. Yeah.
I will say before we get to that, Zoe, I know we're running short on time, but if there's just like one final general piece of advice you would leave any woman in a revenue role with, what do you think it would be?
I would say advocate for yourself. That's like the one thing I didn't do early on enough in my career. And in that, like, the best piece of advice I ever received was actually meant to really hurt my feelings by a VP I had early days in sales. And basically, he gave somebody else on the team a promotion to teach me a lesson. I was above them on the board by a little bit. Like, I put in like more work. I was just like objectively better, but only by like 2 or 3% if you were looking at the numbers. And so he promoted that person because they had more tenure than me. And then he said to me, he was like, you left it too close to call. Never leave it up to the umpire. And he was like, I didn't know you wanted the promotion. He's like, I saw you working hard, but like you never told me you wanted it. And to be honest, like you weren't 10% better than that other person. You weren't 15% better. You didn't make it the obvious yes. So I mostly promoted them just to see if you'd work harder. And it like stopped me in my tracks. It was a really weird way to teach me that lesson, but I never forgot it. And so the 2 things that I took away from that were always advocate for yourself, let people know where you want to go and what you want to be doing, and never leave it up to the umpire. Be so good, be so objectively good that you are the obvious yes. It's always about making it an easy yes for people. And I think that's one of the best ways to advocate for yourself.
That's great advice.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I think we're going to have you back on at some point to talk about how do we advocate for ourselves? Because women are actually really bad at it.
Oh my gosh. I'm
So
still,
bad.
I'm not perfect at it.
I'm
but
terrible at it.
I'm really bad.
I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my God, they're doing such an amazing job. Don't look at me.
Don't look at me. Yeah.
So Zoe, as you know, we always wrap up each episode with 5 would you rather questions that are specific to you. You don't have to explain your answer if you don't want to. They can be rapid fire, or you can feel free to explain.
Okay.
But are you ready for your questions?
Let's get it.
All right. Question number 1. Would you rather never be allowed to post on LinkedIn ever again, or never be allowed to advise for any company ever again?
Advise for any company. And I think that's because the advising for a company is like very acute and it's awesome. And I learn a lot. And I really like what I learned doing that. But the ability to help more people is more interesting to me. And therefore I would rather help
Love
the
it.
masses than help an individual company.
Love it. Question number 2. Would you rather be a head of marketing or a head of sales?
Actually, I think I would rather be a head of sales, which is like kind of a crazy take. So something that I have been thinking about, and I recently had my first run as a head of marketing. That was a really fun and incredible experience. I learned so much just by like doing the work. But I missed sales so much. And that's part of how I ended up in the role that I'm in now at Apollo, is because like I get to be so closely aligned with the sales team. I get to work for a sales tool. I get to actually use the tool and kind of run a little bit of sales within the marketing team for various parts of my role as well, like even for content creation and stuff. And so I've missed sales. I think I say I'm a salesperson trapped in a marketer's body because that's like where my heart is. And yeah, I just think salespeople are the most fun.
Obviously. I mean, as two salespeople ourselves, we couldn't agree more.
Right. We're a little biased.
But also, like, please don't fire me, Apollo, for being a marketer. I like my job a lot.
We will riot if they fire you.
Yes,
No,
not
okay. They wouldn't. That was a joke.
For legal reasons, that was a joke.
For legal reasons, that was a joke.
Question number 3. Would you rather be a speaker at SaaStr, or would you rather be a speaker at HubSpot's Inbound?
Ooh, so I've spoken at SaaStr, so I think Inbound would be next.
Yeah.
SaaStr was great, but I think I would love to try my hand at Inbound.
Nice.
So if anyone from HubSpot is listening, we found your next speaker.
Perfect.
Would you rather only be allowed to post photos of yourself in cat pajamas on LinkedIn? So every time you make a post that has a picture of you, you have to be in cat PJs. Or every time you post, you have to include a cat meme that has no relation to whatever you're talking about.
Okay, are the cat pajamas footy pajamas, or can they be any cat pajamas?
I think any. I didn't clarify, so I'll say
Then
any.
I would do the cat pajamas. If they were footy pajamas exclusively, I would say no, because I hate footy pajamas. But
Yeah,
I feel like the irrelevant cat memes would be hard. People would be like, what is this? But I do love good memes.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I hope to see you in cat pajamas soon. All right. Last question. Would you rather give a 10-hour talk on building a personal brand with no break, or have a man mansplain to you why tattoos are unprofessional for 2 straight hours and you can't leave?
Oh, that's such a good... I think 10 hours. I think I would rather just go marathon for 10 hours and talk about personal brand, because I gotta say, it like breaks my heart every time somebody says something like piercings or tattoos are unprofessional. I'm like, it's 2023. Who cares?
They're self-identifying as
so, like self-reporting. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's it for the Would You Rather questions.
Oh, man, good one.
Enjoyed those.
Those are fun to make. Okay, so I guess we'll wrap it up. The entire purpose of our podcast is to elevate the voices of women in revenue. So we love hearing from people who have made it into leadership positions, especially as fast as you did, Zoe, people who are out there doing the work. I think it's you're making a bigger impact than you even realize by living out loud on LinkedIn. So that's awesome. And for those listening, you can find Zoe, of course, on LinkedIn. I think Twitter too. Are you on
I'm
Threads
like loosely
now?
on Twitter and Threads. I would say I'm more predominantly on LinkedIn and TikTok at this point.
LinkedIn and TikTok.
Yeah,
Okay.
not too corporate on TikTok.
Okay, perfect. So find her there. And yeah, she's living the life of sales, marketing, but all from her own perspective, which I think is all we can ask. And if you'd like to listen to Zoe's song, Toxic by Britney Spears, you can find our playlist on Spotify. You can search for Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue playlist. That's it. Thank you for listening. Keep supporting each other out there, ladies. And if you're not already posting on LinkedIn and building your brand, go do it.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thank
This was
you.
a lot of fun. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue Playlist. This show is powered by Comsor, the go-to-network company. Comsor is the complete suite of tools for teams looking to grow, activate, and engage their networks. If you enjoyed the learnings and banter in this episode, there's more where this came from. Follow Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue Playlist wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. See you next time.